In one of those towns that seep into the world asleep and serene, hidden beneath the cold morning mist and glittering under the golden noon sun, she lived. The city of Valley of Silence. Its cobblestone streets and old, slanted roof houses told stories of a long history, yet within their quiet walls lay whispers of a past not yet buried. There, where peace seemed perfectly woven, the threads of our story began to unravel. Prepare yourselves, for we are about to plunge into a world where the line between reality and nightmare is nothing but a thin thread of shadow. Karim was not an ordinary detective. His obsession was reading what was never written, hearing what was never spoken. Murders left a bitter taste in his mouth, as if they were a personal insult to the justice he believed in. He didn't know that what was coming would be entirely different. It wasn't a murder, it was a ritual of chaos. It all began on a rainy autumn night. His phone rang late, the voice on the other end tense, belonging to a young officer on patrol. "There's a body, detective, in the old house by the edge of the forest. It's different." When Karim arrived, the house stood as a monument to neglect, its wood rotting, windows coated with dust, but inside told another story. There were no signs of forced entry, no chaos, no scattered blood. Just the body of a middle-aged man, Mr. Walid, sitting comfortably in his armchair in the living room, as if he had simply dozed off. But his eyes were wide open, frozen in absolute terror, trapped in the instant of death. And the strange, the unique, the terrifying part was the shadow. It was a human-shaped shadow, but it wasn't Walid's. It was detached, cast upon the wall behind him like an independent being. And that shadow held a dagger, while Walid's real hands rested innocently on his knees. The shadow was the killer, or so it appeared. There was no weapon in the room, no blood, only that surreal scene that defied logic. Karim refused any supernatural explanations. There was a murderer, and there was a crime. But when the coroner examined the body, the true cause of death was revealed. Cardiac arrest. Death by fear. Walid had seen something so terrifying his heart simply stopped. But what had he seen? And what was the secret of that precisely drawn shadow on the wall? It wasn't paint. It wasn't blood. It was just a shadow, but the wrong one. Karim began his investigation by digging into the victim's life. Walid was a well-known antiques dealer, a successful businessman on the surface, but beneath that facade lay a cruel man who exploited his partners, stole their ideas, and drove families into ruin. He had many enemies, yet every suspect had an airtight alibi. As Karim wandered deeper into the maze of clues, the killer struck again. This time, the victim was a famous lawyer, Miss Yasmin. She was found in her luxurious office, seated at her desk, her eyes wide with that same frozen terror. On the wall behind her, her shadow held a gun pointed at her head, while her real hands calmly arranged papers. The cause of death? Once again, her heart stopped from sheer fright. Panic began to grip the city. There was no traditional killer. There was a ghost. The legend of the shadow killer spread like wildfire. But Karim noticed a pattern. Both victims were connected to an old case, the collapse of Al Amal Company 20 years earlier, which led to the suicide of its founder, engineer Moataz, after he lost everything to the betrayal of his partners. Walid and Yasmin were among those partners. Karim realized he was dealing with a vengeful soul, someone linked to Moataz, exacting revenge in a terrifying psychological way. The goal wasn't simple murder. It was mental torture before death, forcing the victims to face their own guilt, manifested as their treacherous living shadow. He began tracking the remaining partners from that cursed deal, the businessman Seed and the broker Fuad. Karim tried to protect them, but the killer was always one step ahead. Seed was lured to an abandoned warehouse under the pretext of a deal. When Karim and his team arrived, it was too late. Seed lay dead on the floor, his shadow on the wall strangling him. No one else was there. He had died in terror, killed by his own shadow. The only clues the killer left behind were those distorted shadows and a short video sent to each victim's phone hours before death. The clip showed the victim's shadow committing a vile act from their past, accompanied by a whisper. Regret travels on the wings of darkness. The killer planted fear in their hearts long before the final moment. Karim, a man of logic, began to doubt his sanity. How could a human do this? How could someone control shadows? He felt himself being dragged into a spiral of madness, each layer pulling him closer to the abyss. After Said's death, Fuad was the last remaining target. Karim hid him in a secret apartment, safe, unknown to anyone. He thought it was secure. But on a moonlit night, while Karim was out buying food, he returned to find Fuad kneeling in the middle of the room, staring at the wall. He wasn't dead yet, but his spirit was broken. He kept whispering, "It's here, the shadow, it's moving." And on the wall, Fuad's shadow was moving, slowly raising its hand as if to strike. There was no source of light to explain it. Fuad screamed, then collapsed. His heart stopped. He had witnessed the impossible. Something broke inside Karim that night. He had seen the crime unfold before his eyes, without a culprit in sight. The room was sealed, the windows locked, and yet the shadow moved. Desperate, he scoured every inch for an explanation, any trick, any illusion. Then he found it. A tiny hidden camera inside a hole in the wall, and a small, highly advanced projector concealed in the next room, perfectly aligned to cast pre-recorded shadow movements. It was a theater of terror. The killer wasn't a ghost. He was a man using technology and psychology to execute his crimes. That discovery led Karim back to Moaddaz's case. Who could be so skilled with engineering and optics, and filled with such hatred? Then he remembered. Moaddaz had a wife and a son. The wife had died of grief a few years after his suicide. The son, Ayman, had been a child at the time, reportedly sent to an orphanage, and then vanished. His investigation uncovered the name Dr. Elias, a prominent expert in optics and holography, who had lectured about deceiving the human mind using light and shadow. Comparing an old photo of young Ayman with a current one of Dr. Elias confirmed it. They were the same person. Ayman, now Dr. Elias, lived in his father's old house, abandoned on a hill overlooking the city. The same house where Moattaz had taken his own life. Karim infiltrated the house at night, bypassing the alarm system. What he found inside was the lair of a mad genius. Screens showing footage of the victims' lives, miniature crime scenes, complex machines designed to manipulate light and shadow. The two men finally faced each other. Ayman was calm, composed, his eyes cold as ice. He confessed everything. He had spent his life planning revenge on those who destroyed his father. He didn't want to simply kill them. He wanted them to die the same way his father did. Broken, terrified, and consumed by their own guilt. He had spied on them for months, studying their fears, then created custom videos showing their shadows performing evil acts, before setting up his devices to make those shadows come alive, enhanced by subtle hallucinogenic gas to blur the line between fear and reality. They all repented in the end, Ayman said softly. I saw the terror in their eyes, the terror of themselves, of their own shadows. That is true justice. Karim tried to reason with him, to tell him that real justice doesn't belong in human hands. But Ayman had crossed the point of no return. He pressed a button and the lights went out. The house came alive with moving lights. Shadows on the walls began to twist and writhe. Karim's own shadow started moving independently, raising its hand as if holding a gun. Even Karim's rational mind faltered. Fear crept in like ice through his veins. He was facing the weapon itself. You have a shadow too, detective, Ayman whispered from the darkness. The shadow of failure, the shadow of those you couldn't save. Do you want to see it? In that moment, Karim understood. The real battle wasn't against the man, but against the illusion. He smashed one of the screens, causing sparks and chaos. Using the momentary confusion, he lunged at Ayman. A brutal fight broke out in the darkness, illuminated only by flickering machines and writhing shadows. At last, Karim overpowered him and placed him under arrest. Dear listeners, thus ends our tale, The Shadow of Regret. The case was closed, the killer imprisoned, but the shadow left behind did not vanish. Karim, the brave detective, was never the same again. He would often stare at his own shadow for long moments, wondering where the line truly lay between justice and vengeance, between good and evil, between the ghosts that haunt old houses and those that dwell within our hearts. Remember, each of us has a shadow. It may be silent, it may be loyal, but it follows us everywhere. And in the dark of night, when you're alone, you may wonder, are you controlling your shadow, or has your past given it a will of its own? Beware, for regret, like a shadow, never leaves. It may sleep for years, but one day it will rise again, carrying with it its own darkness. Sleep well, and may your shadows remain gentle companions through the night.